In the bustling streets of Marrakesh, Morocco, a shocking tale of greed, betrayal, and unimaginable cruelty unfolded. A tale so horrifying that it shook an entire nation and ended with one of the most chilling executions in history. This is the dark story of Mohammed Mesfewi, the infamous barber of Marrakesh. In the crowded alleys and sun-baked courtyards of Marrakesh at the turn of the 20th century, life moved with an ancient rhythm. Merchants hawked spices and textiles in the souks, storytellers drew crowds in the Jamar el-Fnar, and families lived by honor, reputation, and the careful exchange of trust. In a place where a tradesman's word could stand for a man's integrity, the small workshops and stalls were the arteries of daily life. It was into that woven fabric of ordinary trust that Mohammed Mesfewi was quietly stitched, working as a cobbler, a shoemaker whose hands mended the city's footwear and who, by most outward measures, was just another craftsman eking out a living. Yet behind the plain workbench and the flap of the shop curtain, a darker commerce took place. Mesfewi's life centered on a single, consuming hunger, the desire for money and the comforts it could buy. The modest coins earned from repairing soles were never enough for him, and in the company of a much older woman known in sources as Rahali, he began to cultivate a cruel and methodical enterprise. Rahali knew the streets and the subtle vulnerabilities of the city's young women, those who sought small opportunities, occasional work, or who trusted a friendly face in the marketplace. She became the lure, a warm word, a promise of help, a tip about a possible match or a small job. The victims were often girls and young women from ordinary families, those for whom the prospect of a little gift, a promise of advancement, or simply a kind word could tilt a difficult life toward hope. Once Rahali had led a girl toward the cobbler's shop, the darker pattern repeated itself. Contemporary reports and later retellings describe a chilling routine, a hospitable offer of food or drink, substances slipped into a cup that dulled resistance and consciousness, and then the act itself, sudden, violent, and final. Mesfewi used a blade, a dagger or razor kept among his tools, to kill the stupefied victims. Their jewelry and small possessions were stripped away, their bodies hidden beneath floorboards or buried in shallow pits and nearby gardens. The scale of the crimes only became clear once grieving families tracked the last known movements of a missing daughter and followed those traces to Mesfewi's neighborhood. When officials finally searched his shop and adjoining spaces, they unearthed a scene that turned private grief into public horror: bones beneath floorboards, scraps of clothing, and the remains of life violently cut short. The numbers were devastating. While exact counts vary in different contemporary newspapers and later summaries, the most commonly cited total of victims connected to Mesfewi is 36. Whether the tally was 36, 30, or 20, the essential truth was the same: a trusted man had used his position to prey on the vulnerable, again and again, for paltry gains. When authorities confronted him with the physical evidence, Mesfewi offered a bleakly pragmatic confession. He admitted to the killings and explained them in the bluntest terms: theft and monetary gain. He described, without theatrics, how he had drugged and then killed the girls, taking what little they carried. His accomplice Rahali, who had brought victims to him, died shortly after the arrests. Accounts suggest she did not stand trial in any meaningful way. The city's reaction was swift and visceral. Families wept openly in the souks. The marketplace, which had once been a place of daily routine and exchange, filled with a growing rage as news spread. Men confronted officials, mothers demanded a punishment that fit the horror. Foreign newspapers seized the story and spread it elsewhere, lending an international glare to a tragedy that had already ripped at the social fabric of Marrakesh. Under pressure from a horrified populace, the courts moved quickly. Initial reports claimed that extremely severe punishments were considered. Some contemporary witnesses and later retellings mentioned sentences that echoed ancient forms of retribution, while other reports say foreign diplomats and consuls pressed for the abandonment of the most archaic spectacles. What crystallized into the final, reported outcome was extreme and intended to be unmistakable: a public, painful, and final judgment that would make a lasting impression on the city. In the days before the final sentence was carried out, Mesfewi's humiliation became its own public drama. He was brought daily into the marketplace and subjected to corporal punishment, beaten with rods and struck with thorny branches, ritualized displays meant to satisfy the crowd's thirst for retribution and to mark his fall from neighborly tradesman to monstrous criminal. Each flogging served both as physical punishment and as a ritual statement. The community would not forget, nor allow this betrayal to be silenced without being witnessed. The sentence that followed was immurement, the act of sealing a person alive within a confined stone or brick cell. This was not a common modern judicial practice, and even contemporary observers found the spectacle difficult to catalogue as either justice or mere show. In mid-June 1906, commonly reported as June 11, 1906, in front of a vast assembly of townspeople and visitors, Mohammed Mesfewi was marched to a narrow enclosure prepared in the public square. The cell was described in accounts as scarcely wider than a man's shoulders, barely tall enough to allow a person to sit upright without comfort. The physical measurements vary slightly across retellings, but the psychological effect was uniform. The space would make breath itself a scarce commodity. Witnesses reported that as masons and guards packed the stones and mortar around the opening, Mesfewi protested, begged, and pleaded for mercy. He cried out for forgiveness, promised repentance, and struck bargains too late to be believed. The crowd, inflamed by grief and fury, would not relent. As the final stones were set and the light dwindled, his voice became a raw, rising sound, then a series of ragged cries. For many who remained in the square, those cries continued for hours into the night. Some accounts say the shouts persisted across 2 days and then, finally, were silenced. Whether the precise number of hours or the physical sensations beyond that stone shell are preserved accurately in every telling matters less than the communal impression a man who had turned hospitality into a trap had himself been forced into a living tomb. For Marrakesh, the event was a deep and lasting rupture. In the immediate aftermath, there was a mixture of relief and unease. Markets reopened, and the rhythms of daily life resumed, but the city would not fully return to its former innocence. Parents spoke of the events for years as a warning. They took pains to teach their daughters the signs of false kindness and to avoid invitations from strangers, however tempting. Travelers who later visited Marrakesh sometimes heard the story repeated as local lore of a grim parable of trust betrayed and of a society's ferocious demand for justice. Abroad, reactions were split. Some newspapers framed the immurement as a form of necessary retribution in the face of such heinous crimes. Others condemned it as a brutal, archaic practice. Debate surfaced in the press and in salons. Was the punishment fitting, or had Morocco crossed into cruelty itself? These are questions that historians continue to ask when examining not just this case but other moments where law, crowd sentiment, and morality collide. Yet behind those debates lie the irretrievable human losses, dozens of women whose lives were cut short for reasons that, by his own admission, were about money and greed. Their stories are fragments, names erased by time in many records, but their absence reshaped families and stamped a scar on the city's memory. In retelling this tragedy, it matters to remember that the crimes and the punishment both lived inside a very particular historical moment, a Morocco where local customs, the pressure of foreign observers, and the intensity of communal honor all intersected. The Mesfewi affair became more than a criminal trial. It became a mirror reflecting the fears and demands of a society confronting an unfathomable betrayal. For generations, the tale has been repeated with variations, sometimes exaggerated by rumor, sometimes trimmed by retelling. But the core remains: a cobbler who used his position to prey on the vulnerable, an accomplice who lured victims with false promises, and a public decision to punish in a way so final and visceral that it could not be easily forgotten. The echoes of those days in mid-June 1906 continue to teach a hard lesson, that evil can hide in ordinary places, and that communities, when confronted by such an evil, will respond with both law and fervor, responses that themselves become part of the story history remembers. The morning of the execution arrived heavy with expectation, and the marketplace filled with people who had come not only to witness a sentence but to bear collective witness to an ending. Men, women, and children stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the narrow enclosure, prepared to receive the man whose crimes had been uncovered beneath the very floorboards of the city. Mesfewi was brought forward under heavy guard, bruised from weeks of public flogging and shorn of any dignity that his former position might once have afforded him. His silence at the trial had given way to pleading and frantic appeals as the crowd closed in on the spectacle. He begged for mercy, for a chance to confess fully, to atone in some way. His appeals fell on faces that had known grief too intimately to be swayed by sudden contrition. In the final moments before the cell was sealed, he fought the men who held him, clawed at the stones, and cursed the fate that had overtaken him. The masons worked with methodical precision, each stone set to deny not only movement but also hope. As the opening narrowed, the city held its breath. For those who watched, the sight was at once a climax and an indictment. The community was saying, in the harshest possible terms, that the normal protections of neighborliness had been profoundly violated, and a public, visible rupture was required to restore order. The first sounds to emerge once the enclosure began to stifle air were confusing, muffled thumps, weak cries, the sound of someone trying to find footing in a space that allowed no real footing at all. The crowd reacted in different ways. Some shouted with approval, as though vindicated, others fell silent, the cruelty of the scene sinking in like a physical presence. Outside press reports later described a crowd whose mood shifted over the hours from vindictive triumph to a quieter, uneasy reflection. It is said that by the second day the spectacle had lost its rawness and settled into a grim reality that weighed on witnesses. Whether his cries lasted for hours or for nearly 2 days, the image that remained for many was the same, a human voice gradually growing hoarse, cut off, and then gone. In the weeks and months after, Marrakesh tried to stitch its daily life back together, but the event left marks, a scar in the public memory and a story that elders told to children as a warning. Shops reopened and markets hummed once more, but parents kept closer watch over their daughters, and the idea that someone within the community could commit such atrocities was no longer unthinkable. At the same time, outside observers debated the ethical dimensions of the punishment. To some, the immurement seemed an appropriate cultural response in a moment where ordinary legal instruments felt too pale to match the outrage. To others, it was an act that blurred the moral authority of the state and the crowd, trading law for spectacle. Later historians and ethicists would reference the Mesfewi case when discussing how justice systems interact with public sentiment, when mobs demand blood, when courts are pressured by grief, and when punishment becomes a communal drama as well as a legal consequence. Beyond scholarly debate, the human dimension persisted. Families of the victims continued to grieve and to try, as best they could, to piece together the lives that had been cut short. Names were remembered in private, small altars of memory were kept, and in family histories the lesson persisted, never to trust blindly, to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. In collective memory, the story of Mohammed Mesfewi also became a cautionary tale about the limits of appearances. A man who repaired shoes in the morning could also, it turned out, conceal a methodical cruelty. The ordinary surfaces of social life, shops, greetings, and small favors, could mask an abyss beneath. And yet the city's answer was also revealing, a community that chose to confront horror with the most unmistakable possible act, one that would be spoken about for generations. If there is a final, uneasy take from the Mesfewi affair, it is this: the line between justice and vengeance is often drawn in the public square, and once crossed, it produces consequences that are themselves historical. The immurement of Mohammed Mesfewi closed one chapter of Morocco's difficult history, but it opened others, questions about how to balance the need for moral order with the risk of perpetuating cruelty under the name of justice. For storytellers and historians alike, the case remains an object lesson. We retell it not to sensationalize, but to remember the victims, to understand the social pressures that shape public punishment, and to reflect on the way communities respond when the ordinary fabric of trust is violently torn. The memory of those lost girls endures in the warning their story provides. That kindness must be offered with care, that vigilance is a community duty, and that societies must shape their justice so that it stops predators while not becoming predators themselves. The events in mid-June 1906, when a city closed a wall over a man who had hidden a grave beneath his shop, stay with us because they are extreme, because they confront us with the worst a person can do and the hardest choices a society can make. In remembering them, we ask not only what was done, but what we must do differently next time.